May God's grace be abundantly clear to us today as we again learn His loving purpose for our lives. I'm here near the corner of Broad and High Street in Columbus for this reason. We remember what was happening here a couple months ago, the turmoil that was going on. On Monday, May 25th of this year, George Floyd died while being held down by Minneapolis police officers, even as he cried, "I can't breathe." And you know the turmoil that happened as a result of that. In response, this is what we did at St. Luke. The first 2 Sundays in June, we decided to change what we had planned to talk about and focus on the issue of racism. The first Sunday, I taught that we should listen more and talk less as we learn what we need to learn about what's behind the unrest. And so the second Sunday in June, we did that when we invited 2 African-American church leaders, Pastor Tyus Ned and Alvin White, into a conversation where Pastor Mike and I mostly listened and learned. We said at the time that we would revisit this issue in the future. Well, today is one of those Sundays when we're going to revisit the issue of racism and what is our response to what is happening. Well, I am in a quite different setting now along this wonderful hiking trail. And I wanted to be here because the illustration I want to use to talk about fault versus responsibility came to me as I was hiking a few weeks ago. Katie and I had the wonderful opportunity to spend a week with our children and their spouses and our grandchildren all together down in the Hocking Hills. We spent several of those afternoons and days hiking in the Hocking Hills. And as you know, if you've been there, some of those trails are very busy and there are many people on the trails. So one day we got off the beaten path and onto a trail. I don't know if it had a name, but a couple features along the trail was a place called Airplane Rock. Another was called 21 Horse Cave. They're really cool. But there were hardly any other people on the trail, which was a wonderful experience for us. Well, I'm hiking down this trail in the beautiful part of God's creation, and I look down and I see this along the trail, a plastic bottle. And I look down at that, and I have to tell you, some anger rose up inside of me, because that's a really big wrong for me, to carelessly trash up God's creation. And I looked at that for a moment, and then I picked it up, and as I continued walking, I was thinking to myself, whose fault is that that's along the trail? It's not my fault. I didn't put it there. I suppose unless we start to think about the general fault we all have for being so reliant on plastic products in our culture. But that's a pretty big discussion. But I thought, it's not my fault. I didn't put it there. Some careless, in my mind, sinful person put it there. But what's my responsibility? I hope you're saying, pick it up. Well, it's not my fault that it's there. It's my responsibility to correct that evil. And so I did, and of course when I'm done using this as an illustration for this sermon, I'll put it in recycling. That's an illustration that can apply to a lot of social evils in our culture, including racism. While a social evil might not directly be our fault, it is still our responsibility to work to correct that evil and bring good into the lives of others. There are many passages in the Bible that teach us this responsibility that we could turn to. But we're just going to look at one of them today, a teaching of Jesus. So let's together sit at this wonderful picnic table at the park and talk about how Jesus teaches our responsibility to correct social evils and to bring good into the lives of others. We read this passage from Luke chapter 12 today. I want you to look at the dynamic nature of the first 2 verses in that passage. Jesus begins by saying this, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom." This is all grace. This is all just 100% the love of God in our lives, that through no effort of our own, our Father has given us his kingdom. And we are among his flock, his family. It's all gift that we've been given. But look at the next verse, the dynamic nature. Verse 33, Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. We see in these first two verses the dynamic here. We've been given so much by God through Christ. And our responsibility then is to give to the poor, to care for those that are in need. We see the word responsibility here. It's a response to what God has given us. And you see in the word responsibility the word response. It's a response to what God has given us. It's our responsibility. This response, Jesus goes on in verse 33, is to say, is our treasure that we have for us in heaven. A treasure that cannot wear out or cannot fail or cannot be taken away. It's permanent. Nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. And our treasure that we store up is the way that we respond to this gift by caring for others. In verse 35, Jesus begins to use a parable about the second coming of Jesus. Just so that we are on the same page, we believe as followers of Jesus that he's going to return one day to fully restore his kingdom in heaven and on earth. And Jesus says we ought to be always ready for him to come back. It could be today. And he uses a parable about a servant or a manager that a master puts in charge and then leaves, the master being Jesus. And that we should always be ready as the servant, as the manager, to be doing what the master wants us to do when he returns. That he'll find us ready so that we can immediately open the door to him. You know, you've been in that situation, I'm sure, where someone unexpectedly shows up at your house, but you're not ready for them and you're rushing around to try to get ready. We don't want to be that way. We want to be always ready for Jesus to return, to restore his kingdom. And we can immediately open up the door to him. Jesus says that the wise servant or the wise manager continues to do what the master wants the servant or the manager to do. And therefore is immediately ready to welcome them. In verse 42, Jesus says this, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? You see this connection Jesus makes to caring for the poor, for feeding the hungry? That's our response? Verse 43, Jesus says, it will be good for the servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Jesus goes on to describe how bad it'll be for those servants who know what the master wants us to do and yet are not doing it. Or even worse, doing the opposite. Abusing others and abusing the privilege and the creation that we have around us. So that we can have a clear understanding of what Jesus is teaching us, hear this. Jesus wants us to care for the poor and to work to free the oppressed. In the racial reckoning that we are talking about today, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, our Master Jesus wants us to work to correct the racial discrimination that has been the stain on our American experience from the start. In other words, he wants us to say, pick up the trash, correct it, and work to bring good into the lives of others. Look how Jesus concludes his teaching. He says this, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one whom has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Let that sink in, dear ones. Those of us who have received much much is expected of us. While a social evil might not directly be our fault, we still have the responsibility to work to correct that evil and bring good into the lives of others. Jesus calls us to use what we have to bring good into the lives of others. And this certainly applies to the racial reckoning that we are going through in our culture because of what happened after the death of George Floyd. What is our response to that? Whether or not we see any of this as our fault or not is not the point. But rather, as followers of Jesus who want to be faithful servants of the Master, is to use what we have, our power, our privilege, our possessions, to work to correct this social evil of racism and discrimination. We are to live more for others than for ourselves. That's always the way of Jesus. And this teaching of Jesus and many other teachings in the Bible call us to do the work of justice, to help to improve the lives of those who have been oppressed and discriminated against. Can we now sit back and relax for a moment in order to try to remove the conflictual politics of this issue and remember what is the core of this social evil of racism? It's simply this, that there's a group of people whose skin happens to be darker than most of ours. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them report that in their lifetimes, they've experienced being discriminated against or negatively profiled simply because of the color of their skin. To reference the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they've experienced being judged not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. That's the current reality that we are walking through in this life. And in the lifetime of some of us who are older, we know that many of the parents and grandparents, and maybe before them great-grandparents of our black brothers and sisters, experienced brutal oppression in the Jim Crow South, as well as discrimination and great restrictions when many of them migrated to the North. That's why we needed the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. Why we needed the 19th Amendment that we celebrated this week, the 100th anniversary of, giving all women, including black women, the right to vote. But it's also why we needed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, because even though they had the right to vote, many of them were prevented from voting. Why we needed the 1968 Fair Housing Act, ending discriminatory practices in housing, and other legislation that helped to end, or hopes to end, discrimination. And we know that the ancestors of many of our African American fellow citizens, most of them in fact, were brought here in the chains of slavery and forced to work their whole lives without pay and living under horrible conditions. Now we can say a lot of that or none of that's our fault. But we still have a responsibility to work to correct this evil that's still among us. Slavery and the racial oppression that followed the Civil War have been the great stain on our American experience. Those wrongs that have happened and continue to happen, that is the condition that people of color experienced and some continue to experience. To deny this is to intentionally ignore what's right in front of our eyes. It's like seeing a plastic bottle on the path thrown away and not seeing it or picking it up. We got to get rid of this trash. And I'm not talking in any way about people, of course, but about this trash of this social evil of racism and discrimination. So deeper than any political party or opinion or agenda, Jesus calls us to love others as He's loved us, to do whatever we can to correct the discrimination that continues to contribute to keeping others down and poor. This is the response that love requires of us because of what we've received. And of course, we need to engage in constructive debate about how best to accomplish this. But we cannot ignore it. We can't do nothing about it to change it and then claim in some way that we are faithful followers of Jesus. For He calls us to a responsibility. I invite you to remember this from today's sermon. While a social evil might not be directly our fault, we still have the responsibility to work to correct that evil and bring good into the lives of others. So here's the next step to consider from today's sermon. If you believe that the oppression and discrimination that grows out of the long-standing racism in our culture is not your fault, and therefore not your responsibility to work to correct, I invite you to spend some time thinking more about that. To ask the Lord what the Lord thinks about that. And consider changing your mind about this, and then finding a good work that you can do that will help to correct the discrimination and bring good into the lives of those who have less because of the discrimination. To use the illustration again, as you are walking along your path of life and you see some trash that you think, I didn't put that there, it's not my fault, to take the responsibility to pick it up, to correct that evil and bring good into the lives of others. God be with you today, and may you know His love is with you. Have no fear, little flock, for the Father has chosen to give you the kingdom.